All right, guys, let's start talking about the poetics of invention, how to actually build an optimized story world. Poetics is just a big fancy word that means rules or best practices. Aristotle, way back in the day, wrote a book called Poetics, where he talked about the poetics or the rules of storytelling and how to create the three-act story and things like that. And in regards to world building over the years and over the decades and even over the centuries, we've been able to look at some of the master world builders, Lucas, Rowling, Martin, Tolkien, Pratchett, people like that. And we're able to see best practices, see through lines that are consistent in all of them. And we're able to extract those principles and now apply them to our content in our worlds. It's one of these things where if all the eight greatest story worlds all do 10 things similarly, we should probably do the same thing. We should probably use those eight principles somehow in our world, and then sort of innovate on top of that, right? There's always room for putting your own spin on things, but there's only so many ways to do this thing. You don't have to necessarily reinvent the wheel every time. Let's build on the best practices of others, and that's what we're talking about with this concept of poetics, the poetics of world building or the poetics of invention. And so the first aspect of that is once you have your big idea formed, once you have your soapbox world that needs your soapbox, high concept special sauce, once you have that high level big idea formed, now we have to start getting a little bit more specific, because a big idea is just that, it's just an idea. Now we actually have to build the world around that idea. And the first aspect of that is we have to put it somewhere. Like physically, geographically, we need to put the story world somewhere. Is it a city? Is it a neighborhood? If it is a city, what city is it? Is it a fictional city? Is it a real city? Where is it located? If it's a planet, where is the planet? Is it in our solar system? Is it a completely new planet that you have created? Literally, where is this place? And a lot of times when you're doing the big idea, you may just say, well, it's an old west city where there are no men, only women. You may not be concerned with exactly where that old west city is yet. Is it in Mexico? Is it in Texas? Is it in old Mexico? Where is it? Now at this point, once you have that big idea formed, let's put it somewhere, and let's put it in an unfamiliar place. Now, what this does is it preys on the curiosity of human beings. And what I mean by that is human beings naturally like to explore locations that they're not familiar with. So if you go to a new city that you've never gone to before, Paris, New York City, wherever, Helsinki, doesn't matter. What you typically want to do is you want to go out and explore. You want to go look around. If you go back to the hometown you grew up in, presuming you haven't been gone for 40 years, but if you're pretty, if you go back regularly, every time you go back, you don't necessarily start exploring and looking around and driving around because you're familiar with everything. You know where all the good restaurants are. You know where everyone lives. You know all the back alleys. You're familiar. And so the unfamiliarity of the story world is going to inspire people to want to explore it, because that same curiosity that they have in the real world, they carry over them into the fictional universe. We use the example all the time that in 1977, two movies were released with the same budget, the same target market, basically the same everything, the same genre. One was a really good movie, and the other became a $60 billion brand. The one that was a good movie was a Steven Spielberg movie called Close Encounters of a Third Kind. The one that became a $60 billion brand, of course, was Star Wars. And it's interesting to look at that, because I think most people can agree the best pure filmmaker out of Spielberg and George Lucas is Steven Spielberg. And so Steven Spielberg was asked that they asked him, why do you think that George Lucas and Star Wars outperformed Close Encounters when you are arguably the better filmmaker? And he said, very simple. He said, one, George always had a vision for more than one thing, right? He always had a big vision for what Star Wars could be. He always viewed it as a brand. He always viewed it as a scalable thing. But then also he created a world that people wanted to explore. He said, I never thought about my story world. I was really only focused on the plot and the characters. But he created a world that people wanted to continue to explore. And then once he tapped into that curiosity, he began to just roll out more and more and more and more and more stories, right? And so that allowed it to scale. So Steven Spielberg attributes vision and unfamiliarity to the success of Star Wars over Close Encounters of a Third Kind. I think that's a really interesting point to make. And so again, what we want to do with unfamiliarity, we need to put your story world in a place that is unfamiliar to most of the audience. And what we want to do is we really want to kind of focus on a primary location in the story world. So it's a starting point that we can kind of really nail and then kind of build out. And so you may look at your high concept and you may say, well, this high concept involves the whole world, or it's an entire solar system, or it's an entire galaxy. That may be true. But what I want you to do is I really want you to give your story world an identity by focusing on a primary location. The primary location is where your high concept's really going to be on display the most. And we're going to nail that and try to get it to be definite. Try to get it to be somewhat, closed off. I don't want to say closed off, it's not the right word, but somewhat really defined, so that we can really nail that. And then we're going to build extra stuff around it, right? So of course, when you say what's the story world for Batman, it's the broader DCU, or what's the story world for Thor. Well, it's the broader MCU, right? Yeah, but that's true, and that it's not wrong. But there's also a primary location that is associated with both of those characters. Thor, his primary story world is Asgard, right? Of course, he goes to Nevada, and he goes to New York City, and he goes to that weird trash planet in Thor Ragnarok, whatever that was called, right? So he can travel outside of Asgard into the broader MCU, but really Asgard is sort of his home base, his headquarters, his primary location. Excuse me. It's the same with Batman. Batman can go wherever he wants outside of Gotham, and that's fine. But still, he has a primary location that is associated with him, which is Gotham City. So when we're going to pick an unfamiliar location, really be definite. Okay, really almost be myopic in your approach to picking it. Of course, we can build the rest of the galaxy out later, but we don't want to eat the whole elephant in one bite. Let's just pick a spot, pick a city, pick a town, pick a country, pick something that has defined edges and borders, and then we're going to build from there. We're going to call that a primary location. So when we're talking about unfamiliarity, there's a few different ways to achieve unfamiliarity, and a few different types of unfamiliarity. And the first type of unfamiliarity, and you don't have to necessarily check all these boxes, but as long as you're achieving unfamiliarity in one of these ways, or one way at all, that's really what we're looking for. And so the first way to achieve unfamiliarity is really pick a real world place that is unfamiliar to most people. It's called real world unfamiliarity. And so most places I think people are familiar with, or places like New York City, LA, Chicago, at least domestically, London. There are some places that have been used so much in entertainment that they're sort of these ubiquitous, very common locations, and they start to feel generic over time. There's nothing unfamiliar about them. Even if you've never been to New York City, you're familiar with New York City just because of the Marvel Universe and all the other 8 million shows and movies that have been set there. And something like even something with the news and 9/11 and things like that. If you're old enough to remember those things, we're familiar with New York City. And so what we want to do is when you're trying to find a place in the real world to put your story world, try to find a place that's a little unique, that hasn't been used a lot. And so if you look at something like Ozark on Netflix, I mean, that story could be told anywhere, right? That story could be told in New York City or Chicago or really, St. Louis or wherever. but instead of doing it in a generic city, they did it in the Ozarks in Missouri. Watchmen is another great example of this. Watchmen could be set anywhere, right? I mean, this is sort of a broad, high concept. If you've read the graphic novel or seen the movie, it's sort of broad. But in the TV show and sort of the modern media market, it was really interesting because they took Watchmen and they set it in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Now, there's historical story narrative reasons why they tied it to Tulsa, but Tulsa, Oklahoma is honestly just a really interesting, weird, offbeat place to set a story, and it added this really unique aspect to it that's pretty cool. Fargo is one of my favorites. You know, Fargo is this weird Minnesota nice, don't you know, sort of people who do these dastardly things to each other. But this crime drama could be set anywhere, right? But the fact that they set it in Fargo just makes it off the beaten path. It just makes it unique and unfamiliar. I love Daredevil, right? Now, Daredevil set in New York City broadly, but if you find yourself operating in a familiar story world, maybe even, that's pretty large. Maybe find a pocket inside that larger generic story world to really focus on to achieve that unfamiliarity. And so, whereas Daredevil is set in New York City, it really focuses on a certain part of New York City, which is Hell's Kitchen. So even if you've been to New York City and visited, you've probably been to Manhattan, maybe Brooklyn, but you probably, odds are, aren't super familiar with Hell's Kitchen. So when you set a show in Hell's Kitchen, all of a sudden it's interesting, right? Or a little bit more interesting than it was before. Glee was set in Lima, Ohio, which is just a bizarre place to set a TV show. It helped sort of position the soapbox of the show, and did a lot of, it really, there was a purpose for it. It wasn't just random, right? It helped the narrative in a lot of ways, but it really helped form the high concept, honestly. But again, super interesting story world. Sharp Objects was cool. This is an HBO show with Amy Adams, and tremendous show, dark show, really super interesting show. That was also set in Missouri, but it was set in a weird little place called Wind Gap, Missouri. And Wind Gap, Missouri is odd and offbeat. And if you read the book or you watch the show, it's sort of the Stepford wife place, where everybody has these deep, dark secrets underneath, and the kids don't ride bicycles around town. They just roller skate around town, which is just odd. A lot of weird stuff going on in Wind Gap, which then makes for a really interesting story world. And then recently, Project Power, which is the new movie that dropped on Netflix. That is an interesting, interesting high concept, but where they put the story world wasn't sort of in one of the major media markets that we see and mostly used in other forms of entertainment. They set that in New Orleans. And so New Orleans then makes for a really interesting offbeat location. And so again, try to, instead of using Vegas, maybe use Atlantic City. Instead of using Chicago, maybe use St. Louis, or maybe, instead of New York, use Atlanta. I think, any of those places become just a little more interesting because they're just not so overused. One of my favorite ones was there's a Netflix show called Bloodline with Kyle Chandler that could be set anywhere, but they set it in the Florida Keys. And the Florida Keys has a super interesting culture. Even if you understand Florida, that's cool. But then the culture of the Florida Keys is just something unique that adds a really interesting element to the show. So again, if you're looking for a real world location, just find a place that hasn't been used a lot, that most people don't know about, and all of a sudden it kind of freshens that story world in a good way. So, second way to engineer unfamiliarity. Let's say that you want to use a generic, what I would determine as generic, overused, familiar location. And let's say you want to use New York City, for example. You can still engineer unfamiliarity by shifting that familiar place on the timeline, right? Shifting it into the past or shifting it into the future. And what I mean by that, so let's take something like New York City. New York City to me is very familiar, feels generic at this point, but if you shift it in the timeline, right? If you shift it in the timeline into 19th century New York City, back when gangs in New York City, you have achieved unfamiliarity. If you explore New York City in the 20s, then that is an unfamiliar New York City, or New York City in the 30s, or New York City in the 40s, or New York City in the 50s with this classic film, Into the Waterfront. The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, set in the late 50s, early 60s of New York City. The Deuce, which is on HBO, set in mid 1970s New York City, which is was a really weird time for the city. Something like The Get Down on Netflix was set sort of late 70s, early 80s of New York City, as we go out of disco and into the hip hop era of New York City. Interesting, unfamiliar time. Maybe you said it in the 90s in New York City, which sort of had its own vibe as well. Or maybe you push it into the future and you get a futuristic New York City, like Escape from New York City. So however you do it, whether you can shift it into the past or shift it into the future, all of a sudden now any of those places become unfamiliar. And so, if you're using LA, if LA is familiar, maybe you go back into the 80s and explore 1980s LA. And that's what Glow did on Netflix. Sort of this. Of course, that was when historically the women wrestlers were there, but it adds an element to the story world that's pretty cool, right? And so, so think about that. How do you engineer unfamiliarity with a familiar place? Explore different parts of the timeline. So let's talk about the last one. The last way to engineer unfamiliarity is to create what's called fictional unfamiliarity. And fictional unfamiliarity is super easy. All you got to do is create a place that doesn't exist, right? Create a place that doesn't exist. So now we're talking about creating something like Avatar, right? Or Pandora in Avatar. Or maybe we create something like Westeros in Game of Thrones, right? Just completely creating something fresh and something new. These are unfamiliar per se, automatically unfamiliar just by definition that they don't exist. No one's ever been to Westeros. No one's ever been to Pandora, right? Now, you may think this is easier. Well, it's easier as far as the unfamiliarity goes, but what happens if you want to do something completely new, then you're sort of burdened with having to work out all the crazy details of how does gravity work, and what's the culture like, and does the economy work, and there's all these sort of granular questions that you ultimately will have to answer. And so it's we already know how gravity works in St. Louis, right? We already know how the gravity works in 1920s New York City. But if you go to Pandora and Avatar, then we're gonna have to answer that question, right? How does childbirth work, and like what's the religions like, and things like that. We'll talk about those aspects later, but you may be saving yourself some time on the unfamiliarity front, but just be warned that if you do a fictional primary location, completely fictional primary location, then you may just be you're ultimately be creating some more work for yourself down the road, which is fine. Just be warned and be ready for that, right? So, but at the same time, you can create a fictional a fictional story world, right? But at the same time, it doesn't really achieve that unfamiliarity. So like if you created a small town that doesn't exist, Hawkins, right? Hawkins, Indiana, in Stranger Things. Hawkins, Indiana, technically is fictional, doesn't exist, right? But does it achieve unfamiliarity automatically? Not necessarily, because even though it's fictional, all the rules are still exactly the same, right? All the everything still, it's like every other small town that you can imagine. And so you have to figure out, if you do create a fictional place that is similar to other things that are real, then what is that point of differentiation? Almost like a special sauce element to the location itself. So Hawkins, Indiana becomes unfamiliar because of its high concept, because of, it has portals to the mirror dimension. But when we're talking about fictional, it's not just creating a different small town that doesn't exist. It's sort of, it's more of the wholesale thing, like Pandora, like Westeros, right? Like Tatooine or the Star Wars galaxy, something like that, right? But if you want to do a fictional small town or a fictional city that doesn't actually exist, or something like Gotham that is supposed to be in the U.S. but not officially, we don't exactly know where it is. Just make sure as you do that, there's some points of differentiation. Some of the rules are changed, where what makes it different than every other big city or small town or whatever it is in the country. Make it unique in some aspect to achieve that unfamiliarity, and you'll be fine. So again, focus on this primary location and figure out how we can engineer unfamiliarity. Is it going to be real world unfamiliarity? Is it going to be timeline unfamiliarity? Is it going to be fictional unfamiliarity? And talking about real world unfamiliarity for a second, I want to share with you a short video of Shonda Rhimes talking about Grey's Anatomy and why she set Grey's Anatomy, the show, where she set the show, because she highlights this exact conversation we're talking about. Showrunners and creators, we get really granular in these details. They're all super important to us. You may think that this isn't a big deal, but it should be a big deal. And listen to her discuss sort of her reasoning of setting Grey's Anatomy where she ultimately set it. Check this out.
The hospital is in Seattle, and I was just curious if you put a lot of thought into the setting, or if it was just kind of like you needed a big city, or how you picked.
Well, Seattle was interesting. We wanted a big city. I'm from Chicago, and so I wanted it to be in Chicago, but ER was in Chicago, Chicago Hope was in Chicago, like everything was in Chicago at that time. And so getting something that was in Chicago was not going to happen. Everyone was like, every hospital is in Chicago. New York felt too big somehow and not replicable, not replicable in Los Angeles. And Seattle felt fresh to me. It also, when I really thought about it, New York felt wrong, Boston felt wrong. Seattle felt like a city that I hadn't seen on television a lot. And it felt young, and it felt new, and given now thinking about the tech stuff that's been going on, it felt like, oh, like there's new stuff happening there, business is moving there, things are going on up there. And so it was kind of fun to think of that as a place where we could do something. And it turned out to be perfect because it did allow for this ferry boat obsession that I began to have when we made the pilot. But this idea that there are woods and there's a city and it was beautiful and it had every element that we kind of needed to make a place feel particular and special and grounded in place. The one thing
So I want to stop it there. Again, I think that is just an interesting conversation that reflects exactly what we're talking about. Is she wanted some place that felt interesting, it felt fresh, it didn't feel overused, right? Because again, the principle with unfamiliarity is if you create a place that's unfamiliar, you're going to increase the chances that your audience will want to explore. And hopefully, if we do this thing right, they're going to want to explore across platform. So that is the first step. Once you have your big idea, the poetics of invention, of really building the architecture of the story world, the first rule is put it in a place that's unfamiliar to most people.